Welcome everyone. I'd like to say hello to another webinar within our special webinar series on quality and standards in the fight against COVID-19. My name is Dorina Nati and I'm here today with Ms. Stephanie Wering, international expert on conformity assessment, and Mr. Bernardo Calzadilla Sarmiento, the director of UNIDO's Department of Trade, Investment and Innovation. Thank you to both of you for being here with us today. Before we start with our session, I would like to share with you some information about previous and upcoming sessions. So we do have this series of webinars which started with a panel discussion on 17th of April on standards and testing in the fight against COVID-19 with renowned panelists, and was a very successful discussion. We then had another session on organizational resilience last week, which was presented by Mr. Osama El-Meliki. And today we will talk about the role of conformity assessment during the times of COVID-19. We do have upcoming sessions next week. There will be one session on auditing and management system certification during these challenging times, and another session on harnessing innovation and how we can use innovation standards to build a better world after COVID-19. Today's session will focus on conformity assessment during the times of the pandemic. After some introductory remarks by Mr. Calzadilla, Ms. Stephanie Wering will present the topic, and we will follow with a question and answer session. All attendees are encouraged to post their questions in the Q&A window at the bottom of the screen. You can type your question there. We will select the most relevant questions in the context and pose them to the expert. Please consider that we will have a limitation in time. We might therefore not be able to address all the questions that will be asked. We want to apologize in advance if this is the case. In order to take full advantage of the technology we're using, we will record the session, and the recordings and the slides of the session will be made available to the audience thereafter. Well, having said that, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Bernardo Calzadilla Sarmiento, who is the director of UNIDO's Department of Trade, Investment and Innovation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorena. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. We are really in a new world, and as I say, this outbreak has forced us all to migrate, and we migrated into cyberspace. And now we are here, and the big question remains, how are we going to go back to reality? Are we going to back, and how? Today, I have the pleasure also to be at my UNIDO office. I had to do some paperwork and fetch some documents. And the interesting thing is the feeling of what happened after this outbreak. And so many so many things have been changing. We know, and I'm not going to lecture about the whole disruption that we had in the economy, supply chain disruptions, all the problems that are going, because today we have been focusing on what is the role of standard testing laboratories, but more specifically, and what happens with accreditation, what happens with conformity assessment. This is a wide topic because quality and standards more than ever will be called to play an important role. With conformity assessment and standards, we're in the business of building confidence, of building trust. And this is all about that. And conformity assessment provides the backbone of an architecture that starts with the multilateral trading framework, but is based on specific standards. And today, Ms. Wering, Stephanie, will take us through one specific element of this big architecture. And my pleasure to introduce Stephanie, who we know from the ISO CASCO world and the Committee on Conformity Assessment, where she has been very active in several subcommittees, but she has been in particular the convener of the working group on validation and verification bodies, and with us she has been also collaborating in coming up with a guidance document to the new it seems it will not be so new anymore, but it is the ISO 17025 2017 version, and I always need to make sure that these are CASCO documents are ISO IEC documents, so to acknowledge that this is a joint committee. Stephanie has a big track record in conformity assessment, also at the level of the CENELEC, but also at the level of the Dean. So we are very privileged to have her on board today. And I will not get into her academic background, but she has a very, very strong technical background with academic affiliation in molecular biophysics, and she has been over her career moving up the ladder in relation to standards and testing. So without further ado, and very keen also to follow the presentation, I give the floor to Stephanie. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
It's yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation to this virtual stage. Dear audience, thank you for logging in, and good afternoon or good time of the day you're having wherever you are. You are aware of the title we gave this presentation, the pandemic being the dominant subject of so many communications and conversations in these days. And I would like to take a few moments to relate conformity assessment to the current situation, why it became all the more important at some point and all the more difficult than ever at many, many other points. Don't be disappointed, there is no secret solution. There is no remedy without reservation. There is no magic key to overcome the current obstacles. I admit it took me some time to deal with that there isn't. That we do need to go down in the weeds, nitty-gritty, detailed individual solutions, and developing very specific bypassing or emergency modes for each and every situation we're facing and each and every application of conformity assessment we intend or are obliged to undertake. On the other hand, the more tailored a solution is, the more manageable is the associated risk. And when I say risk, I mean not only the current infection risk or the risk of not getting there because flights are down, I also mean the risk-based approach to conformity assessment when it comes to risking the objectivity, the neutrality, the impartiality of the assessors, the quality of their work, and therefore the reliability and validity of their results. That is the confidence in conformity assessment Bernardo was referring to. So having said that, I would like to walk you through the principles and key activities common to all conformity assessment. I would try to highlight possible exit points for alternative solutions in the current situation, particular difficulties that might be faced at individual steps or activities, and start with a handful of vocabulary. You know that conformity is the fulfillment of specified requirements, and the assessment for conformity is the demonstration that these requirements are fulfilled. And there it begins. If there are specific requirements which cannot be investigated at the time being, if there are specified requirements for a particular characteristic or a particular approach to this characteristic when assessing it, this would be the first step to tackle, to adapt for, to take into consideration when performing conformity assessment during the current pandemic. One suggestion I have here is to talk to those or to get in touch with those who set these requirements. I get to that later. Another term is the object of conformity assessment. Is for the sake of completeness. That can be anything. That can be a very tangible material or product. It can be a very intangible system or process setup. It can be a person itself. It can be an organization or even information that is subject to this assessment. So that's why the whole field is so generically to be applied. As I said, the requirements can come with a mere specification of the object, then the requirements apply to the object itself, but they can also apply to the assessor and the way the assessment is conducted. So the full set of requirements is something that needs to be taken into consideration, whether it is still feasible to be applied or whether an adaptation or some limitations or some other alternative solutions have to be found, agreed upon or negotiated with those who set the requirements. That could be public authorities, private scheme owners, contract partners, all sorts of sources. The conformity assessment is conducted as a series of functions, and I would like to use that as a backbone in order to illustrate possible alternatives or ways to work around the way it's conducted on a sunny day. The start is always the planning and preparation phase, where not only the set of applicable requirements is selected, but also the set of procedures in order to assess these requirements is chosen. Sampling plans and considerations made at this point. And the wording here is so generic that it even applies to the current situation, but you might feel that these are process steps which are highly significant when adapting conformity assessment to the current limitations or possibilities. So there might be different sampling approaches, different sampling plans. There might be alternative methods in order to assess, and there might be, as I said earlier, even an adapted or limited, reduced set of requirements to use as the basis. Likewise, the actual assessment activities, the evidence gathering indicating the conformity of the object can undergo some tailored adaptation to the current possibilities, restrictions, or demands. This is the phase during conformity assessment where the evidence is obtained or created, gathered, that would support the decision whether or not the object can be considered to be in conformity. There are many activities in order to gather this evidence. Obviously, it applies very much to the sort of the item under assessment, the object of assessment, but this rainbow of determination activities could also provide for some flexibility, some substitution, some complementation when the original determination approach would not be feasible in the current situation. So taking a step to the side and making use of perhaps a different technique, a different approach among the determination activities might help to work around current obstacles. Once all the evidence is gathered, there is the next step of reviewing the gathered evidence, basically with two questions in mind. did we gather the right evidence? Is it suitable to indicate conformity or conclude on non-conformity? And that's the quantitative aspect to it, do we have enough? Is statistic on our side? And I think it's obvious that this step in the current situation, when performing conformity assessment under some considerable challenges, the review is very, very important. So if alternative sets of requirements are used to begin with, and alternative approaches to determine the conformity are applied, the review whether this has been done right, whether the right things had been done, and whether they had been done sufficiently becomes even more important. So the review step of any conformity assessment is also a means of continuously assuring the proper conducting of conformity assessment. For instance, it might be a good idea to take into consultation a different person. If the procedure itself does not foresee a four eyes principle, for instance, when the people gathering the evidence are actually the ones after a coffee break perhaps conclude on their evidence gathering results, it might be for the time being good to have someone else coming in and helping out, judging whether this is the right thing and enough evidence. The decision itself is the key and core and central part of any conformity assessment. That is where the question is finally answered. Yes, it conforms. No, it does not conform. So, well, you see me hesitating there. Technically, there shall not be any ambiguity. It's a crystal clear yes and no answer. There shall be no qualification, modification, caveat, yes, but, yeah, but not really. A decision is a decision, and it says, yes, it conforms, no, it does not conform. However, I make this really short and then I rush on because I feel not too comfortable about that, but there might be situations where a qualified decision is the right thing to do. To say, yeah, it's not really conforming, but for the time being, it should be okay. The attestation then is the sort of materialized decision. That's where the results of that conclusion are communicated. One adaptation of the attestation is like this webinar. Instead of me being on stage, in place of the regular signed, sealed and delivered hard copy issues of the conformity statement, there might be electronic means or other crisis adapted ways of getting across that the decision has been made. Also, the attestation captures to which scope the decision applies. So, for instance, is if sort of deviated or shortened limited set of requirements has been used in the beginning, the attestation might capture that. Also alternative approaches and other deviations from the regular procedure. Some conformity assessment applications do maintain this, the validity of the conformity statement during a following surveillance phase. And if you do have that, that is also a possibility of perhaps having some leeway on the time scale. If you stay in contact with your client and if you continuously monitor, survey the object of your assessment, this might give some opportunity to postpone activities, to complement that later, and to compensate for alternative approaches in the initial process. So this is a flow chart of what I just explained. I don't think I have to go into the obstacles that are to be faced during the pandemic. However, I would like to point out that the operations of the client of conformity assessment, that is the one who provides the object of assessment, who is the object of assessment, might range from total lockdown, so there is no facility up and running, so there is no production to be monitored, to highly expanding their production because they either switch or increase the volume of goods in high demand. So there are facilities, instead of producing what they produce, producing hospital equipment, protection equipment during the crisis, during this pandemic and this situation. And that is also a consideration which is not too easy for conformity assessment body, how to assess someone who is not regularly providing this object of assessment and who's just doing their very best to supply the market for the time being, to help out and to come in there and stop them from what they do and audit or assess their operation. So that is also a very difficult part of considerations when continuing the service. There are different types of conformity assessment. Bernardo mentioned validation and verification, so that's the new kid on the block. There are the established three types: testing, inspection, and certification. Testing is an analysis, really, a characterization of the item. I come to that later. Inspection is usually an overall examination. Both types are mostly tied to very tangible objects, so that might be either super difficult in these times to go there and climb the crane or visit the oil rig and inspect the, I don't know, elevator. On the other hand, it might be not too difficult because the department store is closed anyway, or the hotel is closed anyway, and you can take your time to inspect their technical facilities. On the other hand, inspection is capable of dealing with general requirements. So any inspector is able to professionally judge on the conformity on the basis of general requirements. So for instance, is it fit for purpose? Is it safe? And that quality might come in handy very much during the current emergency mode of many operations and productions and ways of conducting daily life. And in that regard, inspection could serve as a substitute or complement to a more detailed conformity assessment. Certification usually is including a surveillance phase. So with certification, you might have some leeway on the timeline with your activities. If you are certifying a management system, which is rather intangible, you might be able to make use of remote approaches by information and communication technology that might work quite well. When certifying products and not being able to visit the production site, however, you might be sent the items and still provide a trustworthy certificate. When certifying persons, you might argue, well, you can do that via Skype easily, but you still do want to make sure that the person answers to the best of her or his knowledge and not to the best of their smartphone results. So with all of that, there are things that might make it easier to overcome the current obstacles or totally impossible. Validation verification is applied to information as being an object of conformity assessment. So the quality lies in confirming that information, and like the general professional judgment, the inspection can provide confirmation of supplied information, could also work around some other procedures that are not possible currently. So with that, I would conclude and argue, and I couldn't have said it better than Bernardo did in the beginning. Conformity assessment is not to be neglected, even though it's more difficult at some points during the current situation. Conformity assessment in most cases is a prevention business, and the insurance industry knows that as well. There is hardly any merit in preventing things from happening. And if, for instance, we do find that the food production perfectly works without the food safety inspectors coming in and poking around, that should be, and that might be my personal opinion, but that could be considered as an accident to happen. So that is something definitely to be considered even in the current situation, providing assurance and confidence in an object. And that applies even more if there are different objects, different demands, different specified requirements in order to manage and deal with the current pandemic. So in that regard, conformity assessment continues to help implementing legal frameworks, compliance with legal provisions, as well as with private requirements and private programs, sector programs, and also, and that has been managed as well, having the supply chain running smoothly and not to be disrupted too much. And as I pointed out, there are ways to provide conformity assessment with some flexibility and some adaptations nevertheless. I mentioned that specified requirements are one item perhaps to be negotiated and agreed upon with the responsible authorities, standard setting, requirement setting institutions, program owners, in order to be able to assure the conformity with perhaps adapted specified requirements. If that's not possible, another opportunity might be to judge on the equivalence instead of die-hard exact conformity. I mentioned that with the inspection activity, it might work and it might be okay for some situations to judge on the fit for purpose, on a general suitability, rather than having the conformity itself stated in order to proceed. Generally, there are alternative approaches, switching between the activities, but even within the activities, switching between procedures, replacing on-site and analog procedures with remote approaches. This is not only webinar and telephone, this can also be taking into account satellite pictures, walking around, having a proxy walking around with a helmet, camera, or other creative but nevertheless sophisticated means. And as I said, on the timeline, there is also perhaps some room for maneuvering and shift dates and extend, postpone perhaps periods of surveillance frequency, for instance, or deadlines for the next date of an assessment activity. All of that has to be corresponded by due diligence of the conformity assessment bodies. They do need to take into account the risk of any alternative approach. And they do need to document that properly. That's the only way of remembering what you did. If you defer from the routine procedure, that's not a trivial thing. You would need to be able to decide and review on these alternatives. So this needs to be really tightly documented and justified. Traceability, once you want to go back and well, trace and track what you have been done and what might have been done not ideally and should be repeated or complemented. And also in order to demonstrate that you yourself as a conformity assessor were doing okay when the responsible check is due, perhaps by an accreditation body, a public authority, your peers, or whoever is in charge of checking the conformity of the conformity assessment. A brief word on testing laboratories. I don't think I have to motivate the key role of any diagnostic medical lab in the current situation. I can't say anything more than expressing my utmost respect for what they're doing and that they're doing it under these circumstances. I didn't write it down, but obviously that applies to research laboratories as well. In order to be able to do what they do, even under stress, even under severe conditions, and even with increased workload, it is a very good recommendation to have standards in place that support not only that the work has been done right with the technical competence and the due objectivity and neutrality and impartiality towards the test results, but also allow for consistent operation even under changed circumstances. And you would know of the most prominent standards, the ISO IEC 17025 for general testing labs and the ISO 15189 for the medical labs. Yeah, this is just a summary what I said earlier on a generic level. There are so many things to be considered for the working conditions of a lab. So there might be infection risks, there might be extra spacing, extra air conditioning needed. There are, with all the transport and travel limitations, perhaps impaired logistics of the samples and the test items. The supply chain applies to the laboratories, obviously. Consumables, reagents have to be there, and the maintenance of the laboratory, calibration certificates expiring, or the maintenance of the equipment is also a consideration which is not trivial and quite challenging currently. The next thing to be mentioned is that with many laboratories, they work on rather tangible items in rather tangible facilities using rather tangible equipment. So that could be very easy during these times because nobody's getting in their way. But on the other hand, it can be very difficult because you really need to be on site. So there is no remote approach to a real tangible test procedure in a real lab setup. So in that regard, it was an excellent thing that the current version of 17025, published 2017, enforced that risk-based approach to the laboratory operations that explicitly as a requirement. It is common sense, and any proper lab manager would have implemented that anyway and taken that to heart. However, now with the new version, any laboratory is actually required to apply a risk-based approach. Again, the risks I mentioned earlier. And that is quite burdensome. That is very far from being a no-brainer. But on the other hand, it provides the flexibility to cope with unexpected circumstances and situations, and perhaps go another route than the routine one. And when assessing the risk and managing the risk, being able to provide continuously the intended results with their reliability and the confidence they found. And last but not least, just for the sake of completeness, I would like to briefly mention the conformity assessors of the conformity assessors. One means of recognizing conformity assessment bodies is accreditation. That's faced with the very same problems all over the board I just explained. So the accreditors adapt their activities currently. They take into account remote assessment, and the international accreditation organizations currently continuously inform on the decisions they're taking, the adaptations they're allowing for, and one important document to be considered here is the IAF informative document 3 and the mandatory document 4. That's why I listed them here. So with that, I would like to close, and I'm happy to tackle any question, and thank you for listening. I have no feedback, so I wouldn't know whether the transmission and the reception was right, or whether I was here with myself on my own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. We were all following. We had around 180 participants at the time, so I think everybody was following patiently and to this very interesting presentation. We did get a lot of questions through the Q&A box. I just wanted to say, if anybody has any more questions and didn't follow right from the beginning, please put your questions in writing in the little Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to take up your question and ask them to Stephanie. In the meanwhile, I will also like to re-mention that we recorded this session, and we will make the recordings and the slides available to the audience. For more information, please always follow our website, the TII Knowledge Hub, under tii.unido.org. And with that, I would like to know from you, Stephanie. So we know a lot of things are happening remotely nowadays. We cannot work in the modalities that we used to work before. So to what extent can we rely on remote assessment results nowadays, especially since sampling, which is a big part of the conformity assessment process, is mainly left to the organization that's being assessed?
Yeah. It depends very much on the object of assessment. I think that's clear. I am aware that the management system community is preparing to provide a great deal of their assessment activity. It's not a call over the phone, so there are more sophisticated ways of conducting it, but there are ways to do so, to provide a secured platform to share documents, for instance, and there are experiences of auditors confirming that sharing documents in a secured environment at some point is no less reliable than sitting together with the auditee in a room and having them as a hard copy on the table. So with management systems, we are quite confident that with low risk applications, low risk in that sense, saying what happens if the conformity is not demonstrated or is not achieved. With low risk applications, almost 100% of the audit could be performed remotely. With high risk applications, safety related results, it is still quite important to perform that on site. Again, perhaps that on-site visit could be shifted towards the surveillance phase, so make use of the flexibility on the timeline there. There are other solutions, I'd say, to cope for the lack of an on-site visit by having someone trusted taking samples, having this documented on camera, having the chain of custody of these samples guaranteed, perhaps a signed affidavit of those who took the sample that they did that to the best of their knowledge and take responsibility. So that is not remote sampling, that is rather having sampling done by someone else, but perhaps following it remotely in a way that can be trusted. You could also have someone else doing microbiological samples on site and then have them send the plate reading results and judge them remotely. So there are ways, but all of it has to be covered with the appropriate risk assessment and appropriate strategies to manage that risk.
Thank you, Stephanie. Another question relates to the conformity certificates. So in times of this crisis and working remotely, how can the authenticity of such conformity certificates be verified online or remotely? Are there any ways this can be done?
Yes. Any certification body is required to have a directory of their certification clients and the objects they certified with them. So even in a normal situation, you would always be able to call or write to a certification body asking, listen, did you actually certify that with this and that scope on this and that basis for this and that object? And that wouldn't be different in the current situation. So just call them.
Thank you. A lot of concerns nowadays relate also to the equipment and to the personal protection equipment, PPE, which is being shipped across borders in huge amounts and at high costs, of course.
Yeah.
Precisely, actually, in Austria, we had a case where the ministry ordered large amounts of PPE from abroad and later found out these were actually not good to go and not protecting anybody because they were not complying with the standards they are supposed to comply. So the question here relates to the role of conformity assessment and how can we ensure through conformity assessment that PPE is fit for purpose without having to ship the consignments across borders and only find out after a financial loss?
Well, one approach could be to make use of these levels. The standardized quality infrastructure allows you to establish. So if you do think in the accreditation system, for instance, where you do agree on the acceptance, on the mutual recognition of results and bodies who provide these results, there would be no technical reason keeping you from accepting the test results on protection masks, for instance, from a test laboratory which is accredited for that purpose on site of production of these masks pre-shipment. So if you make use of the comparability and these ties of mutual recognition and acceptance, or even transparency, even the provision of the test standards and the test procedures and the ability to reproduce and repeat what they did in order to cross-check would allow for more confidence and more reliability in what is to be shipped or what has been shipped. So somewhere along the line should be conformity assessment, and if it's the better way to do that upstream, there should be made efforts to supply and provide it there. If it's the best way to check directly before use, that might also be the case in some situations. But if you want to make sure that nothing is shipped which is not suitable, the suitability check could be made upstream on site, locally, and the means of recognizing and trusting could be based on the international standards and the system of checking these standards.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is, I think, a very good and nice example that shows how important it is to have a proper quality infrastructure and related services in place before entering a crisis, and how important it becomes to rely on mutual recognition, particularly.
Absolutely, absolutely. I just felt when I shaped my answer, why I am doing this for 10 years now and what is the actual reason and motivation for it. Yeah, I agree.
Thank you. Another concern these days is food and food safety. How safe is food for consumption? Another topic that has been relevant since ever, but is becoming even more relevant right now. I'd like to know, how can, during times of COVID, during times of crisis, how can we ensure food and food safety, particularly in a situation where we might be missing proper material to test in the labs?
Well, there are two things. There are the tests, the samples taken from a bakery or, I don't know, food production facility, and there are the laboratory capacities to check for. So both need to be at hand. Regarding the sampling, I would refer to what I said earlier. There might be, I wouldn't call it creative, but there might be solutions to work around the on-site sampling, and it cannot ever replace the visit of an inspector on site, by no means. But it has been proven that with the proper light and the proper camera shedding into the corners, some of what an inspector does on site could be actually replaced remotely. The problem with food safety is usually the short lifetime of the samples. So, and in general, the short sequence of deadlines and periods. I mean, once animals are there, they cannot wait until travel limitations are lifted for the inspector, or once the blossoming season is reached, there is no way to work with these postponed visits by 6 months. Then all the orchards wouldn't be blossoming anymore. So therefore, any step during the way has to be found an alternative, or else something to cope, something to replace, or actually working with different surveillance periods and deadlines and frequencies. For the real tangible, but that doesn't apply only to food, that applies to real things. I mean, airplanes are not the main concern here, but freight trains are, ships are, cars are, technical installations of energy provision are. So with anything tangible, you need hands-on, you need analog procedures. It's very difficult to overcome. And if you cannot travel, if you cannot be on site, the proxy solution might work. I have reports on satellite imaging in agriculture inspections. Yeah, what can I say? There's no magic key. I said that up front. And some things are simply not possible. They're not to be replaced, or they would be no assurance if they are replaced. So that's the trade you'd have to make. It still has to be assurance in the conformity of the assessed object. And if that cannot be granted, there is no replacement.
Thank you, Stephanie. Talking about flexibility, creativity, and adjustments in the conformity assessment services, would you think that self-declaration would be an alternative, at least for a certain period of time during the crisis?
It might complement the independent conformity assessment, and you might depend on the client's personnel and resources in order to replace your regular visit on site. There's nothing wrong with self-declaration. The self-declaring conformity assessment units usually do work as impartial and as competent as an independent specialized body. However, usually the independent conformity assessment is not the intuitive approach. So once it is foreseen and specified as a required feature, usually there are reasons. So with assessing the risk that corresponds to these reasons, perhaps because the internal conformity assessment quality assurance unit does not provide the full scope of business continuity, consistent operation, and facilities the conformity assessment body called in could provide. Now I lost the thread. Usually there are reasons to apply third-party conformity assessment bodies, and if the risk is weighed, there should be no concern for particular solutions to depend on the declaration that the clients of conformity assessments make themselves.
Thank you for that. Now, looking forward, there will be a time after the crisis where we all hope to go back to something that we call now the new normal. So, so people will go back to working in labs. There are now more and more guidance and background documents on a life after COVID and how we will go back to our working space. Do you know if there is any guidance available for laboratories and conformity assessment bodies and how they can ensure that their workers are kept safe while going back to work?
I do not know of any generic approach. It depends very much on the actual application and the actual object under assessment. I know of escalator and lift inspectors who are perfectly capable of providing their services. They do even, as I said earlier, have rather convenient conditions because the public buildings and department stores are closed, and they could inspect without customers or school children running around. So there are no general solutions, and there are not all the conformity assessment personnel exposed to any risks or limitations alike. So some testing labs relying on having their test items sent to them and having a widespread facility and a bench per person anyway, are perfectly capable of continuing to work. And also that is kind of a suggestion to any operation to do what they can do while all the other things are impossible, because we do expect quite a bulk of things to tackle once the new normal is in place, and all the operations, the industry and everything that's related is coming back to full steam. The conformity assessment should be able to provide their services and cover for the increased need after, you know, I don't know, how do you say that, after the crisis? Once the bell rung and it's all over. I don't know. So that's definitely a consideration, how to prepare and how to be able to kick in and be even more effective than needed. But there are no overall guidance on how to do it. They very much depend on the individual application. And as I said, there are many applications not too impaired by specifics of the crisis. Obviously by the overall shutdown or travel limitations, but not specifically by infection risks, for instance.
And talking about the future and the changes that this COVID-19 crisis will bring in general and in particular, what do you think will be the impact of these crises in conformity assessment, in the world of conformity assessment? So on the one hand, what role will new technologies play? Are they here to stay in the context of conformity assessment, of course? And do you think that conformity assessment standards themselves need to be revised or need to be adjusted in the context of the current crisis to serve the whatever comes after?
Yeah, I'd say yes. Bernardo tackled that earlier. It was no CEO, it was no CTO that made us digital. It was COV, if you so wish. So that will stay, I'm very sure. Wherever remote audits, which are possible for so many years now, but not that widely and extensively used as now, that will stay. I'm very sure of that. And technology will also improve. I mean, what's now improvised will have commercial and sound solutions. I addressed document sharing rooms with all the data security around it. So that will stay. I'm very sure of that. The requirements themselves, I don't think they would. They are usually carefully set by the responsible standard setting institutions, governments, or program owners. There, I wouldn't think that too much of a dynamic would to be observed. And likewise, the standards themselves, obviously, they're always few steps behind. That's standardization. They are never the spearhead of innovation. They're always following what is established and specify that. So we do have standards, not even addressing virtual meetings or modern technology. That is one issue we repetitively have on our agenda whenever revising a standard. It's always something that's spliced into the text. Take care of electronic means. And that applies to everything. As we said earlier, electronic means of transmitting a certificate or a mark of conformity. Assessing virtual things, assessing non-tangible things. So that's a feature that's going to be considered eventually in all of the standards. And there was another thing I meant to say. I forgot, sorry. I had three items in mind, but yeah, well, sorry.
No worries. I think I think we are just exploring new ways of working. We were forced to do so, and I don't think this is a process that has an end. So, yes, please.
I got it. Sorry. The risk-based approach is super important. And now that we have it implemented in every conformity assessment standard, very much to the regret and the pain and the complaints of those who have to apply it, I think that really proves to be valuable these days, to be able to actually have some flexibility as being the competent and responsible party for applying, conducting, choosing, and finally issuing the results. And if you do have some leeway there, you are really prepared. I wouldn't say fully prepared or ideally prepared, but you're really very well prepared for any unexpected or difficult, challenging circumstances. So with having that spliced into the remaining standards under revision a few years ago, I think that is quite a key issue for any crisis or any development to come. So,
certainly.
Thank you for allowing me to.
Certainly, risk assessment will stay with us. I think this is something that is important, has been important, but will be even more important in the future. And likewise, other topics are becoming more important, standards and quality being one of them. And with that, I would like to thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much for being here with us today. I think it was a very informative session. We had a lot of feedback. I want to apologize to all the questions that we did not manage to answer in the limited time. I still hope the attendees could take something from this session with them. I would like to remind everybody that this is only one event within our series. We will have we will continue our webinar series next week, where we will have one webinar on Monday on auditing and management system certification in times of COVID, and another webinar on Thursday, the 7th of May on innovation standards and how we can harness innovation for a world after COVID-19. If you want more information on these events, if you would like to register and to follow us, then please go to tii.unido.org. You will find all the information that you need there. And with that, thank you again, Stephanie.
Thank you, and all the best to you.
Thank you. We hope to see some of you again within our series. Thank you.
I would love to.